Joining us now to discuss the US President's visit, David Smith is Washington Bureau Chief for The Guardian. He's in London. With us in the studio, Suzanne Lynch is Washington correspondent for The Irish Times. From Phoenix in the US state of Arizona, Chris Buskirk is editor and publisher of the conservative website American Greatness. And Garrett Martin is a professor and lecturer in the School of International Service at American University. Thanks to all of you for joining us. David, let me start with you. As you heard our correspondent there say it, Donald Trump went to the UK as the disruptor-in-chief. We expected controversy, and he didn't disappoint us. How is this visit being received in the United Kingdom?
I think Britain is in a slight headspin and sense of whiplash, as we've seen in so many other countries around the world, including the United States itself. As ever, Donald Trump disrupting protocol and tradition and what we normally expect from these foreign visits. I think in particular, that interview with the Sun newspaper was a bit of a bombshell where he was very indiscreet, claiming that he had given advice to Theresa May about Brexit and she had ignored it, suggesting Boris Johnson, her great nemesis, would be a great prime minister, and that as things stand, a bilateral trade deal between the UK and US might not be possible. It was not surprising that he backpedaled from some of that at today's press conference. I think he does have a habit of saying one thing on Twitter or in interviews and doing something else when he's actually side by side with a world leader such as May or Merkel or Trudeau. But even that press conference was somewhat freewheeling and quite strange. And of course, this visit also marked by tens of thousands of people on the streets of London demonstrating. George W. Bush did bring out some protests, but this was on a much grander scale, and of course, even featured that Trump blimp wearing a nappy. So it's been another weird 48 hours.
Chris, we get the impression that President Trump, seems to get some kind of pleasure out of breaking with protocol, moving away from diplomatic norms. He criticized his host, and as we heard, they offered his view on Brexit. He also told us that Boris Johnson, the former British Foreign Secretary, who only resigned a few days ago, would make an excellent prime minister. What do you make of the president's conduct?
Yeah, well, I like the expression that your reporter used, disruptor-in-chief, and I'm just reminded of the fact that in the business world, a disruptor is usually considered a good thing. I mean, we talk about Silicon Valley disruptors as not as a pejorative, but as a term of praise, and I'm not sure that might not be appropriate here too. Direct talk is appropriate. We'd have this not only a special relationship, we found out the specialist of special relationships today, according to the president, and maybe some direct talk is appropriate here, particularly when it comes to Brexit. The question from the reporter at the Sun was a little cheeky and got the desired response from the president when he said, "Yeah, Boris Johnson would make a good PM, but on the other hand, May is doing a good job too." I do think he likes to rattle the cage a little bit, and that's part of his diplomatic strategy.
Well, I guess, wearing that moniker, disruptor-in-chief, as a badge of honor could be one thing if he wants to get something, if he wants to achieve something. But what really has he achieved?
I think what he wants to achieve, I don't know that he's achieved anything just yet, but I think the longer-term goal is, and I think he's been very clear about this, I think that the president would very much like to have a two-party bilateral trade agreement with a UK post-Brexit. I think that is a big goal for him. I also think that one of the things he wants to do is try and reestablish the level of intimacy, really, between the US and the UK that had been kind of torn apart under the Obama administration. You remember Obama removing the Winston Churchill bust from the Oval Office. Donald Trump put it back on his first day in the office. And he's trying, I think, to, in his own way, to try and reestablish that relationship on a bilateral basis, not in dealing with the UK simply as a colony of the EU.
Suzanne, is this still a special relationship, or, as Donald Trump put it, the highest level of special?
Well, Britain and America continue to be allies, continue to be military and defence allies, and that's separate, if you like, to his relationship with the EU. But I mean, I think we do need to remember, yes, he's a disruptor, but what he did today is wade in to a hugely sensitive domestic political issue. This could not have come at a worse time, in a sense, for Theresa May. She's had a very difficult week. She published this white paper, this checker statement last Friday, and a white paper this week outlining at last their plan for a future trade relationship with Europe once it leaves the European Union. And two of her most senior ministers resigned, Boris Johnson and David Davis. She's trying to keep her party together. It is very unclear whether she's going to be able to and whether she's going to survive this. So things are very, very sensitive about Brexit. And then we have the President of the United States coming straight in there and, you know, saying it as he thinks as it is, but the suspicions are that he was briefed by, you know, anti-EU people like Nigel Farage and indeed by the Sun. So the idea of another sitting leader coming in to another country and making these kind of statements when things are so politically sensitive is really extraordinary. It's pretty unprecedented in terms of relations between those two countries.
But Suzanne, the fact that he weighed into this, as you point out, a domestic issue, like Brexit, could it have something to do with the fact that he wants a trade relationship, a one-on-one trade relationship with the United Kingdom?
Personally, I think that, yes, Donald Trump wants a trade relationship with the United Kingdom, but he also wants one with the EU, which is a bigger market. And I think he's a man who looks strategically at these things. And when it comes to it, if he had to make a choice, I think he'd be quite willing to actually go with the EU if he had a choice in this. The EU will be a bigger economic power, as I say. So I think allies, you know, and people like Theresa May are well aware, you have to take it with a pinch of salt, what he says. He suggested before that he doesn't really understand how trade deals seem to work, that, you know, countries in the EU have to negotiate together as part of the EU bloc. So he's talked about wanting to bilateral trade with France. That's not going to happen because they're a member of the EU. So, you know, we'll wait and see what happens after Brexit. Yes, he wants to deal with Britain, but I don't know if he would put that ahead necessarily of a trade deal with the EU.
Gareth, clearly there's no love lost between large parts of the United Kingdom and Donald Trump. As David told us, there was that big demonstration in London. We also saw that blow-up blimp of Trump looking like a baby. The question is, you know, if there's so much sensitivity over a visit like this, does it really need to take place? I mean, did Britain have to invite Trump over? What do these visits accomplish?
Well, I first want to sort of go back to one of the earlier comments about establishing an intimate relationship or special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. I would say that gratuitous comments and insulting your host is not generally the traditional way of doing so. So that's certainly surprising. As for the value of those visits, I think generally they are important. There's certainly a lot of pomp and circumstance. They're certainly highly symbolic. But they do send important messages. I think, for instance, the fact that I believe Donald Trump visited 17 other countries before coming to the UK might say something about the fact that the relationship is not quite as special as he was saying during the press conference. I think they are also important because generally those visits are a culmination of a lot of work in the background. They can be a good opportunity to sort of cement agreements or to pursue cooperation, or to discuss a very sort of heady international agenda. I mean, I assume that they talked about Syria, they talked about Iran, they talked about Russia. So these visits are normally important, despite the cases of protests.
David, in a sense, could this visit have been a good thing for Theresa May, the British Prime Minister? Because if you look at what happened, you know, with Donald Trump and his unique brand of discussing international relations, especially when he weighed in on Brexit, the British Prime Minister actually got support and sympathy from her critics in Britain, including the opposition Labour Party.
Yeah, if there's perhaps one thing that can unite the political parties and all the various factions in British politics, it might be Donald Trump in a negative way. That is the paradox of Theresa May overall, really, that on one level the departures of Boris Johnson and David Davis were a blow, but on another they might clear the way for her approach to Brexit. And there is that sense also, if Boris Johnson is, if Donald Trump, there's a Freudian slip, as many would conflate the two. If Donald Trump is meddling and interfering, again, it could generate sympathy for her. So perhaps she was not so pleased when at today's press conference he lavished praise on her that actually might not go down so well with all those thousands of people protesting. It is that difficult situation now, I think, where many in the UK would actually applaud Theresa May if she can keep Trump at arm's length in the same way that many Canadians unified and rallied around Justin Trudeau when he stood up to Trump, and I suspect many Germans do so with Merkel as well. But she's in an exquisitely difficult situation because of that Brexit vote a couple of years ago. Britain is at risk of turning its back on both Europe and the US at the same time because of this unique set of circumstances. So it's a very unenviable position.
Chris, we hear very often from critics, or rather from Donald Trump's supporters here in the United States, we hear from journalists, political analysts here, that Donald Trump doesn't really care about what his critics say about him in the United States, let alone those critics in other countries, in foreign countries. How will his base be looking at his behavior and the manner in which he's conducting this visit in the United Kingdom?
I think the base here in the United States is always looking at the same thing, which is what's good for the United States. And that is in part can be defined in a very narrow sense, maybe a better deal in a trade relationship, or maybe getting the NATO allies to spend more on defense, but also in a broader sense of making sure that we maintain and develop the relationships we have with longtime allies like the United Kingdom. So I think when the base is looking at the president abroad, whether it be at the G7 or at NATO or now in London, they're looking to see how he is representing their interests. At the end of the day, for your average voter, that's what it all comes back to. And I will tell you, there is a sensibility here in the United States that there is this long-term relationship with Great Britain. We do want to maintain that, and to the extent that Britain is able to extricate itself from the mess that is the EU, that is only good for the relationship between the US and the UK.
Would it be fair to say, Chris, that this all falls within that broad doctrine, if I could call it that, of America first?
Yeah, in part it does. America first. I was actually talking with a friend in the UK the other day about this. You know, make America great again. There's a sensibility, I think, that is nascent in Britain as well. Make England great again. Mega. You know, I spent a couple weeks in London last month, and it was interesting. You know, when I was in London, I'm not surprised, based on the discussions I had with people, that there are people in the streets today protesting President Trump. But when I was outside of London, when I was in the countryside or some of the other cities, the attitude towards Trump was much more positive. And so I think, much like in the United States, if you were to ask people in New York or Washington, D.C., they would probably be fairly negative on the president, but the rest of the country, large parts of it, are deeply supportive. The same thing, I think, goes for Great Britain as well. In the metropolis, it's one attitude. Outside, it's another one altogether.